In today's video, we're going to understand what safety precautions should be taken when we're inside the laboratories. Now, every time we board a flight, we often see the flight attendants demonstrating how to fasten our seatbelts or where we can locate our life vests. Now, flight attendants take the time to explain every step, even though some of the passengers have heard these instructions before. So, why do they keep reiterating it over and over? Well, it's because during emergencies, passengers should be aware of what they need to do. And knowing what to do keeps passengers calm and helps them act quickly during times of danger. Now, very similarly, even in laboratories, performing experiments can be exciting, but safety comes first. So, what do we mean by this term safety? Well, whenever we hear the word safety, we associate it with being protected or protecting ourselves. So effectively, safety is the condition of being protected from any kind of danger, risk, or injury. Now, why does safety matter inside the laboratory? Well, firstly, inside the laboratory, so many people work, and it is important that safety practices are followed to protect the people who work inside the lab. And most importantly, we work with various types of chemicals. Some chemicals which can be toxic to our skin or that can harm our skin if it comes in direct contact, and some which are flammable, which means that they can catch fire easily. Which is why it's important that we are aware of safety practices that we need to follow to keep ourselves safe. Now, while entering a lab, the first thing that should be followed is the proper attire, which means having your lab coat on, having your gloves handy, and safety goggles. Now, it's important to have your gloves handy because it creates a protective barrier and safeguards your hands, especially if you are going to be doing an experiment that deals with, maybe using acids or any kind of hazardous chemicals, right? And similarly, there are chances of potential spills or splashes. So that's where wearing a lab coat can protect all of our inner clothing from potential spills or splashes. And wearing safety goggles is again very important because it protects our eyes from various hazards, including flying chemicals or dust or any kind of debris that are there. So having your proper attire becomes step number one in safety practice. Now, once we have our attire ready, as soon as we enter the lab, it is important to wash our hands thoroughly with soap and water. Now, it is recommended to wash our hands before entering the lab because it prevents the entry of any kind of germs or unwanted particles from the outside. And once we are done with the experiment, it's again recommended to wash our hands before we leave the lab so that any kind of chemicals, right, if there are traces of chemicals, then all of that would go away. Now, while inside the lab and when we are handling chemicals, we should be aware of all the safety symbols, because some chemicals would have this kind of a symbol that says flammable material, or some would have this symbol which says toxic material. So flammable materials are those materials which can catch fire, which means while handling these chemicals, we need to keep it far away from any kind of fire source. Or while dealing with a toxic material, we need to make sure that we have our teachers by our side and use protective gear while handling them. And while carrying out any experiment, be clean and organized and promptly clean up spills and messes. Now, when the work area is very messy, where all the flasks are scattered and you have other kinds of books, pens, pencils blocking your work area, this increases the chances for accidents or spillage, which is why being organized will also be an important step in safety, because that way we see that when we are organized, it minimizes the chances for any kind of accidents or spillage. Now, finally, it's important that whenever we are in the laboratory, we should not eat or drink anything inside the laboratory. Now, it's important to understand this because eating in a laboratory can cause, there's a potential for contamination and exposure to hazardous chemicals, which is why food and water can maybe absorb some of these chemical vapors, and if we end up eating inside the lab, then we end up ingesting chemicals that's not good for our body. And any kind of doubts with respect to how to go about certain instructions of an experiment, or if we need to discard some chemicals or maybe break or cut any kind of chemicals, then always taking guidance, right? There's nothing wrong in asking for help, taking help, because ultimately that would mean that you are practicing carrying out experiments in a safe manner. So, very briefly, we have looked at some basic practices that we can follow inside the laboratory to make sure that we keep ourselves and our surrounding friends